So in this week's video, we're going to be talking about a couple of different types of budded seams that were used commonly in the early modern period, but that disappeared a little bit more as hand sewing gave way to machine construction. These are really, really useful to know if you're regularly putting together garments by hand, because they tend to be very, very strong and versatile seam types. So this is the back of an 18th century cotton chintz Italian gown. It's sort of half in a garment bag, so I'm aware that it looks a little bit odd. But so you're looking at the back here, and these are the two fronts, and we've got the sleeves. And then if we turn it here, this is the interior of the gown, and this is what we're going to be looking at. So the skirts of this type of gown are fully detached from the bodice. You can see that they have been pleated into place along this seam line, and the bodice comes to a point at the center back. Now, the way that this is done is using a very simple budded and whipped seam. The skirts and the bodice are put back to back, right up against each other, and we simply whip stitch all the way along. And this becomes quite a strong method of attaching these, because at every point along the way there are multiple stitches holding this sometimes quite heavy skirt in place. There are other ways to attach 18th century skirts like this to bodices. This is certainly not the only way to do this, but that is one method that we see on original gowns. And we also see this very commonly as a way of attaching the panels of 18th century stays. So what you would do is you would sew all of your boning channels in each of the pieces of the stays separately, and you would put your boning material in. You would then turn the seam allowances towards the insides of each piece and stitch them down quite tightly. You would then put the pieces side by side in the proper arrangement and then stitch them together using a budded and whipped seam. And again, that's very, very strong for a garment that has a lot of pressure put on it during wear. So that's a very, very simple, sort of widely used type of seam. We see it much earlier than the 18th century as well, and we continue seeing it into the 20th century. This just happens to be a good example. And you can see on the outside of the dress, here we are with the seam. And you can also see a second line of stitching here. That's from when I attached the linings to the insides of these panels. So that is not the attachment of the skirt. The stitches that attach the skirt disappear into the inside of this seam. The second type of budded seam that we're going to be looking at is the attachment method used for these vertical seams in the bodice. You can see that there's 4 of them side by side here, going right into the point, and then the ones on either side. And if we turn this back to the inside of the garment, you can see that what we have are the linen linings for these panels, and then these tiny little bits of the cotton chintz showing through. And in order to explain how this happens, I will have to show you how to do this stitch. So that's what I'll show you next. So this form of budded seam is used specifically in cases where you have both an outer fabric, which in this case is this mustard wool, and a lining, which in this case is linen. And the lining needs to be cut exactly the same as the outer fabric, and then each pattern piece gets lined discreetly, so separately from all the others. You can't have linings that sort of overlap multiple pattern pieces if you're using this type of seam. So this is used primarily in sort of 17th, 18th centuries, at least as far as I've seen it. And one of the places that you will see it very frequently is in the back of the bodices of 18th century Italian gowns. So that's the type of gown with multiple pattern pieces in the back of the bodice. And that then continues to be used as a construction method for some bodices and spencers in the Regency period and into sort of the 1830s. So I will show you how to do this. So again, you start with a lining piece that is the same shape as your outer piece, and what you want to do is turn the edges towards each other. So my seam allowances are turned towards each other there. Now normally you would hand baste these together
I ended up having to hand baste my wool layer because it was so bouncy that it needed stabilizing, so I've just pinned my lining in place here. And I've already done these, so you can see kind of what it's going to look like at the end. This is really good for pattern pieces with kind of nasty corners because you're finishing all of the edges before you start sewing pieces together. So you have nice finished contours and finished corners that you can then just whip together. So this is a pair of 16th century woolen hose. So this is the foot that you're looking at here. It's still partly inside out, but that is the kind of weird shape that you get on the foot portion, and so that's why I'm using this particular seam method, was because I have all of these horrible corners to put together. So we have our pieces, they're stabilized, the linings are very slightly back from the main fabric on the edges, so we've got just a little bit of the yellow poking up above the white lining. And I have loosely pinned them together, right sides together, okay? So what I'm gonna do is I've come out of the lining here to start, and then I go through the folded edges of both wool layers and come out through the lining on the other side. And I'm using a waxed silk thread here. You just wanna use something strong. Now, right next to that stitch, I'm skipping the lining that I've just come out of, so I'm ignoring that. I'm only going through the folds of the wool and then coming out through the lining here. And so what this is going to do is this is going to attach your pieces and attach the linings to the outer fabric all in one. So you don't need to sew the lining in separately because it gets attached all together in this seam. So again, skipping the lining on this side, but going through all three of the other layers, just through the folds. And you want to pull it quite tight. And we're keeping these very close together. Again, that's what we see on budded seams, is very close stitching. So this will be a very, very strong seam. So it's ideal for areas of garments that are going to get a lot of stress, in this case, the foot portion and the back of the heel. So again, that is the reason for the choice here. Okay, so it's not a fast seam. It depends, of course, on how far apart your stitches are. If it's not a seam that's going to be under stress, you can have them a little further apart, but this particular garment is going to be under a lot of stress, so I'm keeping my stitches very, very close together. And when we turn it right side out, which I will do just by pulling it through here, you can see that it essentially looks like a normal seam. You're not seeing butted edges, you're just seeing a nice normal seam, but it also means that then on the inside we don't have big bulky seam allowances. We've just got this little raised edge of the fashion fabric coming through, and if we were working with something like a cotton rather than this big bulky wool, this would disappear to almost nothing. So this is a very fine seam, very useful if you have weird pattern shapes, and very, very strong. So this is a really good one to know.